It was late. The buka was closed. Sarah had gone home. The village was quiet. Madame Titi sat outside, fanning herself, enjoying the cool breeze. Then she heard a sound. Someone was behind her. She turned, and there he was, David, standing in the shadows, watching her. His eyes were different, dark, hungry. Madame Titi's fat hand gripped her wrapper. David, what are you doing here? David took a step forward. I love you, Madame Titi, he whispered. I know, she said, forcing a smile. Go home and sleep, my dear. David shook his head. No, his voice was shaking. I can't leave you. I can't eat. I can't think. I can't breathe without you. Madame Titi's fat heart did wish, wish. The potion was working too well. David's love was turning into madness, and for the first time she was afraid. Madame Titi swallowed hard. David's eyes were shining in the dark like the eyes of a hungry lion. His breathing was heavy. His hands were shaking. I love you, Madame Titi, he whispered again. I love you too much. Madame Titi forced a laugh. Ah, David, go home and sleep. Tomorrow I will cook your favorite food. David did not move. I don't want food, he said. I want you. Madame Titi's fat fingers gripped her wrapper tighter. The medicine man had warned her. Love made by your passion is not real love. If he ever finds out what you did, his heart will break forever. But she did not listen. Now, David's love was too much, too strong, too dangerous. The next day, David was back at the buka before sunrise. When Madame Titi woke up and stepped outside, he was already sitting at the door waiting. His white shirt was crumpled. His fine hair was rough. His eyes were red, like he had not slept. Madame Titi's fat heart started beating fast. David, she said carefully, did you sleep here? David grabbed her hands. No, my love, he said. I was thinking about you all night. Madame Titi's fat belly flipped. This was not love. This was madness. But what could she do? If she told David the truth, the potion would break and his heart would shatter. If she pushed him away, he might lose his mind completely. She had wanted love. Now she was trapped in it. And worst of all, David was about to ask her the question she had been afraid of all her life. The question that would change everything. David dropped to his knees right there in front of the buka, in front of all the customers, in front of Sarah, who was carrying a tray of hot soup. Madame Titi, he said loudly, marry me. The whole buka went silent. Madame Titi's fat legs almost gave way. This was too fast, too sudden. People started whispering, ah, Madame Titi has caught a rich man. See love, oh, who would have thought? Sarah gasped so loudly that she almost dropped the tray. Madame Titi's head was spinning. If she said no, David might go crazy. If she said yes, she would be his forever. Her hands were shaking. Her lips were dry. Then, before she could stop herself, she nodded. And in that moment, she did not know she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The whole buka exploded with noise. People clapped, some cheered, some laughed, some shook their heads in surprise. David jumped up, grabbed Madame Titi's fat hands, and shouted, she said yes! Madame Titi forced a smile, but inside, her fat belly was turning. She had wanted David to love her, but not like this. Not like a man who had lost his mind. Not like a man who could not eat, sleep, or think without her. She looked at him. His fine clothes were now dirty. His neat hair was rough. His once sharp eyes were now soft and weak, like a man under a heavy spell. And she knew the truth. David was not himself. That evening, Madame Titi sat in her room thinking. She had tricked David into loving her, but now she was the one feeling trapped. How could she marry him like this? Would he ever return to normal? Or would he follow her everywhere forever, staring at her, calling her my love until she lost her own mind? She thought about going back to the medicine man. Maybe there was a way to stop the potion. But then she shook her head. No, if she stopped the potion, David's love would disappear. And if he found out what she did, his heart would break. And if his heart broke, who knew what would happen? No, she had to marry him. There was no turning back now. The wedding was set for the next market day. Madame Titi did not need to buy anything. David brought everything: the biggest cow, the fattest goats, bags of rice, gallons of palm oil. People in the town could not believe it. Madame Titi is blessed though. See how love has changed her life. Some women are just lucky. Lucky if only they knew. The wedding day came. David was smiling from ear to ear. Madame Titi forced another smile. It was a small gathering in a tiny hall at the center of the town. Music played, people danced, and plates of food disappeared quickly into hungry mouths. But amid the laughter and celebration, David's friends stood frozen in shock. David marrying Madame Titi? Unbelievable. The David they knew, the polished, successful, and selective David, was now standing at the altar with a woman who had never been in his league. Something wasn't right. They rushed to him, pulling him aside. David, what is this? One of them whispered. Are you sure about this? Another asked. But David barely looked at them. He waved them off. His face was calm. His eyes were distant, like a man trapped in a dream. His friends exchanged uneasy glances. Maybe it was just Madame Titi's food. Maybe David had simply fallen too hard for her cooking. They sighed and stepped back. The wedding continued. David's family, they weren't there. The wedding had happened too fast, too suddenly. By the time they heard about it, it was too late to stop it. And so, under the dim lights of the small hall, the deal was sealed. And before the sun went down, David and Madame Titi became husband and wife. Madame Titi should have been happy. She had gotten what she wanted. But that night, as she lay beside David in their new house, listening to his soft breathing, staring at the ceiling, she felt something she had never felt before: fear. Because now, David would see everything: the truth about her, the truth about her kitchen, and there was no way to hide it anymore. The next morning, Madame Titi woke up early. She turned to look at David. He was already awake, and he was not just awake, he was staring at her. My love, he whispered, his eyes shining. You are so beautiful. Madame Titi forced a smile. Ah, David, good morning. David sat up. Today, I will follow you to the buka, he said. I want to see how my beautiful wife cooks. Madame Titi's fat heart almost jumped out of her chest. No, he must never see the kitchen. Never. She smiled quickly. Ah, my dear husband, you don't have to stress yourself. Just rest, eh? I will cook your favorite meal and bring it to you. David shook his head. No, my love, I want to watch you. I want to be close to you always. Madame Titi's fat fingers gripped the bedsheets. There was no escape. David was following her to the buka, and today he would see the truth. When they got to the buka, the outside was clean as always. The tables were neatly arranged. Sarah greeted her warmly. David smiled proudly. My wife is the best cook in the whole world, he said. Madame Titi's fat belly turned. If only he knew. She led him inside, and then it was time to enter the kitchen. Her hands shook as she pushed the door open. David stepped in, and then he froze. His eyes widened. His nose wrinkled. He opened his mouth, but no word came out, because what he saw was disgusting. The kitchen was filthy, pots covered in thick black oil, plates stacked high with leftover food from days ago, flies buzzing over half-eaten meat, cockroaches running across the floor. The smell was terrible. It was not the sweet smell of jollof rice. It was the rotten smell of old soup, dirty water, and spoiled meat. Ah, David's fine face twisted in horror. He turned to Madame Titi, his voice shaking. My love, what is this? Madame Titi's fast hand gripped her wrapper. She could not speak. She could not lie. This was the truth. This was her secret. And now David has seen it all. David took a step back, then another, then another. He shook his head slowly. No, 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 this cannot be true. But it was true, and for the first time since the love potion entered his body, his eyes began to clear. For the first time, he started to see the real Madame Titi, and what he saw shocked him to his bones. David could not believe his eyes. The kitchen was disgusting. How could this be the same place where Madame Titi cooked such sweet food? His stomach turned, his head spun, the air smelled like rotten fish and old soup water. David covered his nose. My love, his voice was weak. How do you cook here? Madame Titi's fat hands squeezed her wrapper. She had no answer. She had no excuse. For the first time, she felt ashamed. She, Madame Titi, the great cook of the town, was nothing but a dirty woman. And now, David has seen the truth. David stepped back, his fine face twisted in confusion. His heart was beating fast. Something was wrong. Something in his head felt strange. It was like a thick cloud was covering his brain, a cloud that whispered, love her, stay with her, she is perfect. But now, after seeing the dirty kitchen, the cloud started to crack. The spell was beginning to break. David squeezed his eyes shut. Madame Titi, he whispered, what is happening to me? Madame Titi's fat heart did bish, bish. She knew what was happening. The shock of seeing the dirty kitchen was shaking the potion inside him. And if the potion broke completely, David would never love her again. No, she could not let that happen. She quickly grabbed his hand. My love, my king, don't worry, she said, forcing a smile. Let's go outside. I will clean the kitchen today, I promise. David blinked. His head was still spinning. The potion inside him was fighting. Stay, leave, stay, leave. Madame Titi pulled him out of the kitchen, back to the open eating area. The fresh air hit his face. He took a deep breath. His mind cleared a little. He looked at Madame Titi. Her fat cheeks were sweating. Her big hands were shaking. David's heart squeezed. He still loved her, but something inside him whispered, something is not right. That night, as David lay in bed beside Madame Titi, he could not sleep. His stomach felt heavy, his mind felt strange, and deep inside he knew something was very, very wrong. And soon he would find out everything. David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His heart felt heavy, his head felt strange. All his life, he had been a man of good taste. He liked fine things. He ate in the best places. He wore the best clothes. So why did he marry Madame Titi? Why did he love her so much? Why did the thought of leaving her make his chest tight, like he would stop breathing? It did not make sense. And the worst part, even after seeing her dirty kitchen, even after smelling the rotten soup and seeing the cockroaches, he still loved her. Was this normal or was something wrong? Madame Titi lay beside him, wide awake. She could feel David's body was stiff. He was thinking too much. The portion was shaking inside him. If she did not do something fast, it might break completely. And if it broke, David would live forever. The next morning, Madame Titi woke up before David. She rushed to the kitchen. She had to make sure he never doubted her again. She cleaned the pots, she swept the floor, she threw away the old food, she washed everything. By the time David woke up, the kitchen was shining. She smiled proudly. Now, if he entered, he would think everything was fine. She had fixed the problem, or so she thought. Because what she did not know was the real problem was not the dirty kitchen. The real problem was the love portion. And very soon, David would start to feel its true cause. David woke up feeling strange. His head was heavy. His heart was heavy. His whole body felt wrong. He turned and looked at Madame Titi. She was already dressed, smiling at him. My love, she said sweetly, I have a surprise for you. David forced a smile. What is it? She took his hand and led him to the kitchen. David's eyes widened. The kitchen was clean. The floor was shining. The pots were washed. The air smelled fresh. Madame Titi clapped her fat hands. See? Everything is fine now. David nodded slowly. Yes, the kitchen was clean, but his heart was not. Something was still wrong. Meanwhile, David's friends have tried severally to reach David after his marriage to Madame Titi. They didn't succeed. He stopped hanging out, stopped going to work, and even isolated himself. Many times his phone rang and rang, but David never picked up. Then one day he finally answered, but his voice, it was weak, it was slow, it was not David. David, where are you? They asked. I'm fine, he whispered, but they did not believe him. This was not the same David. The strong David, the lively David, the David who loved life. Something was very wrong. So his friends went to his house. They knocked on the door. David opened, but what they saw shocked them. Their friend was not the same. His once broad chest was smaller. His proud shoulders were slumped. His face looked thin. His eyes empty. David, what happened? They asked. David forced a smile. I am fine, he said, but his smile did not reach his eyes, and the smell of Madame Titi's food was everywhere. They knew he was lying. The next morning, David sat outside, lost in thoughts. He knew something was wrong with him. His love for Madame Titi was too strong, too unnatural. Just then, Mama Tari, the village herbal seller, called his name. She looked at him closely. My son, are you sick? Your eyes looked troubled. David hesitated, then whispered, Mama Tari, how do you know if someone has been charmed? Mama Tari's face grew serious. Why do you ask? David took a deep breath and told her everything. How he had never eaten at a buka before. How his love for Madame Titi started after the first meal. How he now felt trapped, weak and confused. When he finished, Mama Tari sighed. My son, you have been trapped. David's heart pounded. Trapped? How? There are women who use medicine to catch men, she explained. They put it in food. Once a man eats it, his heart belongs to them forever. David's mind raced. He remembered that first meal, how Madame Titi had watched him too closely, how she had smiled strangely and asked, "How do you feel?" Had she really used medicine on him? Mama Tari looked into his eyes. If she used medicine, then you are not really in love. David's chest tightened. Was everything he felt a lie? If you want to know the truth, Mama Tari continued, you must stop eating her food. David's stomach twisted. Stop eating her food? But even when he tried, something inside him always forced him to eat. Mama Tari nodded. The medicine is inside you. If you stop eating, your body will fight. You will feel sick, like you are dying. But listen to me. If you survive 3 days without her food, the medicine will break and you will see the truth. David swallowed hard. 3 days? Could he do it? There was only one way to find out. He had to try. Will David survive 3 days without Madame Titi's food? Or will the powerful spell pull him back into her trap? The truth is near, but the battle has just begun. Don't miss part 3, where secrets unravel, dangers rises, and David faces the ultimate test. Will he break free or be lost forever? What do you think will happen next? Will David resist the spell, or will Madame Titi find a way to keep him trapped? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notification so you don't miss part 3. Thank you for watching.